Hey, everybody. Hey, I'm glad to be with you to finish up the week here with our Market Movers session. I'm glad to see some familiar names in the chat. Glad you're here, and just glad to wrap up the week with you. And I'm also glad to be joined by Mike Fairborn, who's helping me out in the chat. So as you have questions between Mike and myself, we'll do our best to address those questions. You can follow us on X, my X account at Brentmore CS, at Mike Fairborn CS for some additional content. Now, before we get into the week that was and the week that's going to be, maybe, just remember the information today is for general informational purposes only. It's not an individual recommendation of any security, chart type, or strategy. Specific securities we're going to look at are not recommendations. Schwab does not recommend the use of technical analysis as a sole means of investment research. And past performance is no guarantee of future results. All investing involves risk, including potential loss of principal, and there's no guarantee of an execution of a stop loss that it's going to be at or near the stop price. So we're going to do the normal thing we do in this class. What's the trend of the major market indices? What moved the markets this week? And a look at the week ahead, significant things in the week ahead here. So that's the plan. And so let's do it. Let's look at the SPX here. So this is the SPX. This is the trend. This is we dipped down below our 20-day moving average. This was last Friday where we had that really kind of lousy jobs report and the backward revisions of the last couple months. But you got to say, we've recovered pretty strongly. This market, anything you throw at it seems to have shrugged off at this point. Now, that's not to say what it's going to do going forward, but that's what it has done. It's given us a lot of resilience in this market in terms of that trend. And this is the S&P 500. If you consider, say, how we've done year to date, it's up about 9% this year, the S&P 500. How does that compare to, say, the S&P 500 equal weight? This is something I went into the other day. About 2% of the stocks, so 10 stocks in the S&P 500 equal about 40% of its performance. Okay, I did an X post on this the other day. So what if we just equal weight all 500 stocks, or maybe 501? I don't recall. Stocks here. What's the performance been? Is it still about 8.9% for the year? What do you think? More or less? I'm about to type it in. Think about that. Here we go. About half that much, okay? A little better than half, but 4.7%. So those bigger stocks have definitely, that they have outperformed, has helped push the market to better returns on that, okay? Now, what if I put in the NASDAQ? What do you guys think? More or less than the SPX, which was, remember, 8.9%. Well, here's the NASDAQ. NASDAQ, about 12.5%. Okay. And remember, this includes a pretty substantial drawdown in the market. If you go back here to this point of the market, kind of February, March timeframe, the NASDAQ dropped more than the SPX. And the SPX dropped more than the SPX equal weight. And if we look at the Russell 2000, what do you think? How's the Russell 2000 going to be? Actually down a smidge for the year. Okay, so Russell 2000 has underperformed for the year. It's tried to claw its way back up, but Russell 2000 has been underperforming. Now, part of that has possibly been interest rates have kind of stayed high, and that really can weigh on small caps. Where interest rates going to go, I don't know, but we've seen kind of a pretty big change over the past week here in terms of interest rates. So in terms of interest rate, I guess, forecasts, this is the Fed funds tool. Okay, this is the Fed funds, the CME Fed Watch. CME Fed Watch, I should say. It's a third party. This isn't a Schwab thing. It looks at Fed funds futures and tries to assess the probabilities of rate cuts. And if we look at this right now, so current target right here, it's given us about almost a 90% chance of a rate cut from the Fed in September. Okay, this is very, very different than it was about 10 days ago. Okay, this really changed last Friday with the economic data. Okay, and so that is what gives people some more hope, I guess, of a rate cut. Now, this is the Fed funds rate. It doesn't necessarily coincide with what, say, the 10-year is going to be in terms of interest rates, and we can pull that up. Here's the 10-year. And you can see it's kind of eased down a little bit, but it's still, actually, let me get out of the percentage chart. It's eased down a little bit, but we're still about 4.2, 4.3%. There's a general correlation, if you look back historically, between Fed funds rate and this, but it's not always perfect. In fact, last year, the last time we had a significant rate cut in the Fed funds rate, this actually went up there. So but that potentially could be why, I'm just throwing a theory here, why the market is kind of trucking along here is it's hopeful, despite some rough economic data, it's hopeful that interest rates may get cut there. Now, what could throw a wrench in the plans of a potential interest rate cut? One is inflation data. If inflation kicks up and if jobs numbers are good, that combination could make it less likely that the Fed cuts. Okay, so that's about all I want to talk on that interest rate subject right now. But I just wanted to kind of update you on that. But the market has shrugged off stuff, including maybe some jitters on tariffs. We've had a lot of tariff talk and a lot of concern. The market keeps going up. Most recently, it's still in the news though. The administration announced a 50% tariff on India. In fact, I noticed on X a few hours ago, Narendra Modi posted, I guess, on X, tweeted, whatever, that he was looking, I don't know if he was looking forward to a constructive meeting with Vladimir Putin. And so definitely some politicking, I don't know if that's the right word, between the US and India right now regarding those rate cuts. And it affects other countries as well. Switzerland, the US has talked about increasing tariffs, 39% tariff on Switzerland. Well, one of the things that Switzerland does is they export gold bars, gold bullion, like the 1 kilogram gold bullion. Gold, what do we do? It spiked. We hit an all-time high today on gold. All-time high on gold there. Okay, so that is, in fact, let me just look real quick, and I just want to make sure I got my facts right on that. The gold, 1 kilogram gold bars. Okay, so a report came out that the U.S. was going to impose tariffs on imports of 1 kilogram gold bars. And that could impact Switzerland. So they're the world's largest gold refining hub there. So, but gold spiked on that, and that has done quite well. What about other asset classes? And we're going to look at several futures here, but we're not talking about trading futures today. We're just talking about looking at them from a commodity standpoint. Let's look at silver. Here's silver. Silver has done pretty well. Do you know, it's probably not a coincidence that gold has done well and that silver has done well, given that the dollar has done this. The dollar has been very weak, and traditionally the correlation is when the dollar goes down, precious metals go up. Okay? And so that is probably helping those precious metals out there significantly. But there's other, avenues that people or find of interest to invest in. Bitcoin. It's this was its high, 123,000. We're not that far off that. Bitcoin's been pretty strong. And one thing about Bitcoin, kind of one of the knocks on Bitcoin for years has been just the volatility. But we've seen volatility knock down a little bit in terms of Bitcoin. I wouldn't say it's not a volatile instrument, but consider this. Look at Ethereum. Okay, this is Ethereum futures. And if you consider, this actually has pretty significantly more volatility. Look from March, low March, down 13. It was at 1300, up about 4,000 right now on Ethereum futures. So, but one thing with like all crypto, the perception is that this administration is more friendly towards crypto. And in fact, the latest report is, hey, they'll be exploring ways to let people add crypto into like 401ks and stuff. I don't know what the future possibilities of that are, but there just seems to be more discussion in that manner. By the way, there's a survey link in the chat. We always appreciate your feedback, everybody. Other commodities that, may be of interest to you. What about oil? Well, oil's been dropping off. We're down below $64 a barrel. That's a pretty significant drop off where we were up at 78 just about less than 2 months ago there. And, these are pretty, this is the steepest weekly losses since we've had since this period right then. Concerns about the global economy, global demand on oil. And remember, whenever you're talking about oil, there's a supply side and there's a demand side in the equation. And, the supply side can be just from a restriction on, OPEC cuts production or something, or refineries go off, or oil drilling comes down. Wells don't, fewer wells are in operation. That can certainly affect things on the supply side, but on the demand side, global geopolitical risks can certainly affect that, as well as potential demand can affect that. So those are some things. Now, so those are kind of broad, big picture. Let's talk about some individual stocks here, because we are just kind of on the tail end of earnings season. And I think most investors would say, for the most part, earnings season has been pretty positive for most companies. Obviously, there's a mix, some good, some bad. But you always have to be a little careful when you talk about earnings and whether it was an earnings beat, so to say. Here's some companies that had earnings beats this past week. They beat their consensus estimates this week. Fortinet, look what happened. It got whacked. I mean, it was 96 before earnings, and we're now sitting at 74. It wasn't the earnings, but it's future concerns about their ability to kind of refresh their firewall products for future, demand there. So that's Fortinet. That was an earnings beat. Eli Lilly came out with earnings. It was an earnings beat this week. Look what happened to Lilly. Before earnings, $750. We're now sitting at about $628 on Lilly. Yeah, Wiley, you beat me to it here, but we'll get to that in just one sec. That That was an earnings beat. But, concerns is they had phase 3 trials on their weight loss drug that were disappointing. Okay. So a lot of times it is the forecast or guidance that really knocks the company down. This came out after hours yesterday. The trade desk down. I mean, this thing's almost in half, not quite, but it got crushed there. Again, I think it beat on the numbers, or it was close at least, but we had multiple downgrades, and we'll get to downgrades in just a little bit, of analysts about, concerns about future demand and also valuation. When you look at these companies, let me go to TTD here. This is TTD. And let me go to the fundamentals. When you start looking at these companies and you look at the average PE ratio over the past 5 years on this, $230 almost, 230 almost. They're more, when you have something with a high valuation like that, it's when bad news comes, it tends to get hit hard. Okay, so higher the valuation, the harder things tend to get hit when news isn't so good. What about next week? Okay, what about next week? What do we have here? It's still, we're still not technically out of earnings season. No, it's kind of winding down, I guess. I don't know when we officially end it necessarily. We still have NVIDIA coming, but that's still a little ways away. The biggies, I just have S&P 500 companies there. And this is next week. Where's next week? Cisco, and that's John Deere. Okay. So very different than what we've seen in the past. Last week was crazy with just the impact of the earnings, all these Mag 7 stocks, and in terms of economic reports. Well, this week, not so much. In fact, let's look at economic reports and see what happened this week and the week ahead here. So this was this week, and then I want to go back and answer any questions that Mike, maybe some things it's easier for me to show than Mike. This week, it wasn't nearly the report, nearly what we had last week. The biggest items were probably this ISM services number, which was a miss, okay? Wasn't good. Doesn't matter, the market's resilient. The market just kept going up. Market just keeps going up. Unemployment claims. Where do I have those? Right down here. We'll call that a slight miss. That was pretty much in line. But market's resilient. It doesn't seem to be having a problem. Next week is a little bit bigger in terms of economic reports of what's coming forth next week. Because one of the things that is a big concern in the economy right now is inflation. Well, what do we have on Tuesday? We have CPI, Consumer Price Index. And so we'll see what it comes in at. You got your CPI on Tuesday. You got your PPI, Producer Price Index, on Thursday. Which is going to move the market more? Well, if one is a bigger surprise than the other. I think sometimes when you come out with like one of them earlier, like CPI comes out earlier in the week, if there's kind of a big move on that, it kind of steals some of the thunder of the second report. But if CPI came in line and then PPI showed significant inflation, then you'd probably see a bigger market impact there on that, okay? So those are probably the two biggest reports next week most likely to move the market. But there's, a couple other things that possibly could move the market. I could see retail sales is always kind of a bigger report. And the U of M consumer sentiment is, it's not the biggest report out there, but it's worth noting. Okay, worth noting. We'll say that. let's head on back to the Thinkorswim platform here on this, because I want to talk about some other stocks in the news. Let me just see if there's any questions here that Mike couldn't get to, though. There's a survey link, though, in that chat, and we appreciate your feedback on that. Let's see. Mike, I think you got the question on NDX equal weight. Maybe is that the only one I've missed? If you typed in a question, could I get the link on how you located the percentage of the rate fund cut? Oh, okay. The CME Fed Watch tool, you can go to, just Google CME Fed Watch, you'll come up with it, okay? CME Fed Watch, there, okay? That's how you do that. So those were some of the things. Now, let's look at, we're getting near the end of our time together, but let me just look at some other bigger movers in the market. Apple, of like the Mag 7 stocks, Apple's has really been kind of a laggard. Their performance has not been good, but they have jumped up. They really have had a strong week. And it really kind of started with the Tim Cook, what happened was the administration announced that, these big potential tariffs, 100% tariffs on the on semiconductors, on imports of semiconductors, but the big caveat, not for companies that are building in the United States or moving operations to the United States. And Tim Cook had a big appearance, I think it was at the White House, with the president, talking about putting in like $100 billion investment into the US. That really sparked the increase on Apple this week. That was the big move on Apple earlier this week. Now, in addition, there's some other news. This obviously isn't great news, I'm about to read you, but Apple lost about a dozen of its AI staff, including some of its top researchers, to rivals in recent months. So that isn't a great thing. But Apple also got a price target raise. And, the news is maybe the biggest impetus for the move. However, when you get price target raises or increases or price target decreases, that is something that can definitely affect the news. So, for example, when we look at other companies that have had price target changes, Maple Bear, which is Instacart, basically, big move here. It was up even more. That was upgraded. Okay, so that was upgraded. Benchmark upgraded Instacart. That was a big one. And we also had price target raises. Barclays raised the firm's price target. Citi raised the firm's price target. Citizens JMP raised the firm's price target. So those price target raises can certainly affect the company as well, significantly. Interestingly, one we already looked at that had a huge move this week, Fortinet, that was the big move down where they actually held up okay on earnings, but they got really hit by the company. They actually had an upgrade this past week in terms of, let me see if I can find who was the upgrader on that. DZ Bank upgraded Fortinet to buy from hold. Well, that makes sense. And at first glance, you may go, why would you upgrade when all this, this jumped? Well, talk about valuations. That certainly can affect perceptions too. So kudos in a sense. I don't know where the stocks can go from here, but to analysts that upgrade before a stock moves way up or downgrades before the stock has already dropped 30, 40% or something like that. All right. And downgrades, a lot of downgrades, not surprising. One, a stock we already looked at with earnings. The trade desk had downgrades. Here's another company that a lot of you are familiar with that had a big move. Crocs. Crocs was downgraded by Barclays. Okay. It was downgraded by Stifel. Those are big downgrades. And I mean, we were at 105 down to 75. That's a big move there. And let me just see if there's anything else. Oh, last company I want to talk about, and then we'll call it a week, I guess, is Intel. So Intel, which I think a lot of you are familiar with the woes that Intel has had over the past year. If you look at other semiconductors, you can look at that semiconductor index, the SOX, how strong it's been. The SOX is heavily influenced by NVIDIA, how strong NVIDIA has been, really strong. AMD, which had earnings, has held up pretty well, even though the initial reaction on earnings wasn't very good. Intel has underperformed for a while. They got hurt. This one wasn't a huge mover, but the news on that was the president asked for the resignation of the CEO, Lip-Bu Tan, because the president cited conflicts of business due to ties with China. So, I don't know what's going to happen with that, but that's an example of a stock. Didn't move that much this week, but it's been in the news and it's significant. Okay, there's other semiconductors out there. Scott said Micron's finally coming around there. So we'll see. All right, everybody, that was the week we had, and some potential things of the week ahead, earnings and economic reports. Thanks for joining me today. Thank you, Mike, for helping me out in the chat. And there's a survey. Remember that. Thanks to each of you for joining me. Have a wonderful weekend ahead. Bye-bye, everybody.